Before there were seats, there were stairs. And Elijah had climbed all of them. The ones inside public housing units with broken elevators. The ones in schools where the heat barely worked in winter. The ones in buildings where every step creaked like it didn't believe he'd make it to the top. He climbed them all, not with certainty, but with quiet repetition, day after day, assignment after assignment, question after question no one else wanted to ask. He had grown up under flight paths. Jets thundered overhead while he walked home from school, sneakers scraping broken sidewalks, notebook clutched like a lifeline. The sky was always louder than the street, but quieter than the silence of being underestimated. No one ever said he wouldn't become anything, not out loud. They didn't need to. The pauses when he spoke. The lowered eyes when he entered. The way people looked past him when giving instructions. It was all part of the curriculum. Airplanes weren't freedom. They were mystery. Distant high reserved for someone else. Someone with the right passport, the right balance, the right background. Elijah didn't want luxury. He just wanted access. The first time he touched a plane, he was 17. Not as a passenger, as part of a youth summer job at the airport. He cleaned tray tables, wiped windows, restocked carts. The metal under his gloves was cold, unforgiving. But he memorized everything: cabin layout, crew language, emergency protocols. When the others on his shift took breaks, he sat in the cockpit with permission from a tired pilot who never asked for his last name. He didn't take selfies. He took notes. Elijah read technical manuals like other kids read comics. He sketched layouts in the margins of textbooks. When college came, he chose logistics. It didn't sound glamorous and no one envied him for it. But he understood something most people didn't: the world runs on movement. If you can master movement, you control everything. The classrooms were bright, but the expectations were dim. Professors expected competence, not brilliance. They remembered his attendance, not his insight. He didn't argue. He built. Internships passed. Hours in windowless rooms. Meetings where he pored over regional traffic data and watched executives praise less effective ideas from louder voices. He stayed late. Asked questions others didn't care about, not to impress, but to learn. By the time he graduated, Elijah had mapped out an entire alternative route system for regional air travel in underserved markets. Cities no one thought were worth direct flights. Routes too small for the big airlines. Populations too brown, too spread out, too low margin. To most, it was fantasy. To Elijah, it was framework. He pitched it once. Twice. 10 times. The 12th investor looked him up and down and asked where he got the suit. He wore a hoodie to the 13th meeting. It worked. They gave him a fraction of what he needed. He multiplied it. The first iteration wasn't an airline. It was a platform. Shared charter flights. Leased planes. He knew he couldn't start with full-size jets, so he started with pilots, the kind who wanted to fly for purpose, not just hours. He focused on community. Service. Respect. He focused on people who had never been in first class because no one ever thought they should be. And then something rare happened. It worked. Not explosively. Not instantly. But steadily. The routes grew. The loyalty grew. So did the data. Elijah noticed something others missed: people weren't loyal to price. They were loyal to dignity. So he did something bold. He launched his own airline. Not a shell under another brand. A real name. A real vision. Planes with wider aisles, not to feel luxurious, but to feel less trapped. Menus designed around cultural familiarity, not trend. Seats in first class that didn't feel like a throne, just a home. His name never went on the marketing. Not because he was ashamed. Because he wanted the brand to earn trust before the world could use him as the reason it didn't deserve it. When the first plane lifted off under the banner of the company he built, Elijah sat in the last row. Not out of humility. Out of habit. He watched the cabin crew like a conductor watches his orchestra. He saw where the cart snagged, where the tray latches needed rethinking. He took notes. He flew every route. He never told the crew. He adjusted every failure. And the airline kept growing. Then one day on a layover, he booked a ticket for himself. Randomly. Online. No executive treatment. No flagging the flight number. Just a seat. Just to watch. To listen. To remember. And that's how he found himself in seat 1A. Reading. Alone. Until the question came. The flight hadn't taken off, but the story had already begun unfolding. Elijah remained still in his seat, eyes drifting not toward the confrontation, but past it. As the man 2 seats away awkwardly turned his head to feign disinterest, Elijah looked down at the boarding pass still resting in his lap. The code-printed slip didn't matter to anyone else in the cabin. But to him it was the marker of something deeper, not privilege earned through status, but a seat claimed through perseverance. He had never designed the airline for moments like this, but now that one had arrived, it clarified everything. He closed his book slowly and let the weight of the silence settle. Not a single attendant stepped forward. Not one passenger said anything. That was how it always was, he remembered. The world rarely rose to correct its own discomfort. It preferred to stare, pretend, or politely shift away. He didn't need their rescue. He had survived worse at ground level. As the door to the aircraft finally closed and the engines began to whisper to life, Elijah tilted his head toward the window. The cabin lights dimmed to amber. Outside, the runway glimmered like a river of molten steel stretching into the dusk. His thoughts traveled faster than the plane. He remembered the red-eye from Phoenix to New York when he sat in economy beside a nurse who hadn't slept in 2 shifts. She told him she only flew when visiting her mother's grave. He gave her the whole row by pretending to move seats. She never found out who paid for her return ticket. He remembered the storm delay in Atlanta. A young mother, flustered and holding twins, had broken down crying when told her flight had been canceled. He stood silently behind her and rebooked her entire route while she tried to explain herself at the gate. The agents never knew the man who had solved it owned the company name on their badge. He remembered the route from Tulsa, the only route to include an onboard poetry collection curated by a local school. No one ever reviewed it online. But it had been the one detail that made him believe he was building something different. And now here he was. Seat 1A. With his name nowhere on the brochure. And his presence nowhere in the assumptions of the other passengers. It was exactly how he had planned it. The flight took off smoothly, wheels lifting from the runway with a barely there shudder. The nose tipped toward the clouds and the city below dissolved into soft geometry, tiny squares of yellow, blue, and rust. As they reached cruising altitude, the attendants moved into practiced formation. Glasses. Napkins. Warm towels. The man who had questioned him earlier now sat stiff, no longer curious. Just alert. As if realizing too late that maybe the man beside him wasn't just another passenger. Maybe he had judged too quickly. Maybe he had said too much. Elijah didn't flinch. He simply nodded once when offered a drink, choosing water. Always water. It helped him think. Helped him return to himself. He unfolded the in-flight magazine, not because he hadn't seen it, but because he always read the letters from passengers. They submitted them voluntarily. Stories about first flights. Family reunions. The woman who hadn't seen her father in 20 years and used her first bonus check to buy him a visit. The student who flew back home after failing their first semester, unsure if they'd be welcomed or rejected. These were the people he built for. Not the man 2 seats over with his tailored accusation. Not the industry elite who'd refused his early meetings because of his hoodie and quiet voice. Not the media reps who wanted to make him a story of overcoming odds as if those odds weren't manufactured by the very systems they profited from. He built for the people whose names wouldn't trend. And that was enough. As meal service began, the lights in the cabin shifted once more, softer now, with blues that made everything seem calmer than it was. Plates arrived with practiced precision. Silverware glinted. The smells were balanced, curated to be inoffensive but indulgent. He picked at his meal not out of disinterest, but out of memory. He had tasted this menu 100 times during development. Not because he needed to, but because if he didn't, who else would test it with the same standard? He designed each course to avoid the aftertaste of altitude. He replaced sodium with spice. Texture mattered. He even ensured the bread arrived warm, not because warmth mattered technically, but because it mattered emotionally. He remembered the sting of cold bread at conferences where no one remembered his name. Across the aisle, the same man shifted again. He reached for something in his pocket, maybe a phone, maybe just nerves. Then he looked over, hesitating. Elijah didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because power didn't always roar. Sometimes it just occupied space without asking. And he was done asking. The rest of the flight passed in a slow, steady rhythm. There were no more questions. Just quiet. Just gravity obeying them from far below. When the wheels touched down, there was no applause. Just arrival. Just proof that he belonged here. Because he had built the sky they were all flying through. The wheels kissed the runway with a hush of authority, a sound so clean it could have been mistaken for silence if one didn't know the language of flight. The cabin remained dimmed as if even the lights had learned to respect the moment. Elijah sat motionless, eyes still on the middle distance, not looking at anything but seeing everything. Disembarkation began as it always did. Those in first class gathered their coats like royalty exiting a gala, stretching slightly to be seen, adjusting cuffs, checking their reflection in blackened windows. The man who had questioned him earlier stood slower than the rest, offering a glance not of apology but of retreat. Elijah returned nothing. Not a nod. Not a twitch. Because the truth didn't need acknowledgement to remain true. He stepped off the plane last. Not out of caution. Out of rhythm. He had spent most of his life letting others go first, not because he thought less of himself, but because he knew exactly who he was. That kind of clarity couldn't be taught. It had to be carved, layer by layer, from every refusal, every laugh, every time someone had told him you don't belong in this room. And now he was building the rooms. He walked through the jet bridge with that same steady stride, not fast, not hesitant. He felt the artificial warmth of the terminal wrap around him like a coat made of decades. No one here knew his name. But the floor he walked on, the gates he passed, the lighting design, the acoustic dampening in the ceiling panels, all chosen in negotiations he had led, funded by decisions he had made. His airline had become more than just a fleet. It was a philosophy. His engineers understood that airports weren't just about traffic and turnaround, they were psychological gauntlets for people already carrying invisible weight. So they'd optimized everything, signage that used human-centered design, carpets that softened sound, even chairs designed for posture preservation during long layovers. And yet, in this moment, walking among a sea of other passengers, briefcases clutched, earbuds in, coats draped in power, he blended in again. Not hidden. Just misread. Again. And he welcomed it. Because it allowed him to witness what they never would. He passed a coffee kiosk he had personally fought to keep rent-free for local entrepreneurs. He saw a janitor emptying bins by hand, wearing the ergonomic gloves he'd approved after secretly testing them himself for grip fatigue. He saw a young boy pointing at one of his planes through the glass, and for a flicker of a moment, Elijah saw his younger self staring back through time. That boy didn't want a mansion. He wanted access. He wanted proof that someone who looked like him could be more than the one taking out the trash, more than the guy wearing a reflective vest out on the tarmac. He wanted to belong. And now, Elijah's entire life was the answer. He reached the main concourse and took the staff exit, the one they didn't offer to passengers, the one that led through quiet hallways behind the terminals. He'd built these paths intentionally, for when he wanted to disappear into the bones of the system. As he walked, the fluorescent light hummed overhead. Security staff passed him without question. He had no badge on. They didn't ask. There was something in the way he carried himself, as if the air moved around him differently. He stopped at a maintenance door and keyed in a code. It opened into a private staircase that spiraled downward. He descended without haste. This wasn't a shortcut. It was memory. The basement level of the terminal was the first place he'd ever slept during that brutal winter he spent between jobs. He had come to the airport not to fly, but to stay warm. Security had shooed him off eventually, but he never forgot the echo of suitcase wheels overhead while he dozed on cold tile. He remembered thinking, if I ever make it, I'll build places where no one has to hide to survive. And he had. Now, 2 floors up, his airline's office overlooked the airfield like a quiet lighthouse. He reached it without fanfare, scanned his fingerprint at the door, entered. The room inside was simple, no plaques, no glass trophies. Just maps, blueprints, and pinned handwritten notes from staff around the country. One wall was covered in photos of passengers taken candidly with permission, hugging relatives, boarding alone for the first time, crying in the window seat. These were the people he answered to. His team had left for the night. The office hummed with after-hours silence. He placed his duffel bag beside his chair and stood at the wide glass window that faced the runway. Outside, another jet taxied under amber lights. He traced its motion with his eyes. That model, he'd fought for it personally in the procurement phase. Every seat on that aircraft had been redesigned to reflect something the world never gave him growing up. Consideration. Consideration was expensive, but disrespect had cost him far more. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old boarding pass from years ago. Not from today's flight, but from the first time he'd ever purchased a seat with his own name on it. It was torn at the edges. Faded. It read, Zone 5, Group H, Seat 32F. He placed it on the windowsill, not as a reminder of where he started, but of how far the runway could stretch when someone refused to turn around. The morning unfolded without rush, not because the world moved slower, but because Elijah had mastered the tempo of decision-making. He arrived early to headquarters, not because he needed to prove something, but because the quiet hours before the city stirred held a kind of clarity no boardroom ever did. His desk remained as it always had been, unadorned. No titles engraved in brass. No marble. No ivory globe. Just the sound of jet engines in the distance and the filtered light through the wide windows that overlooked the tarmac. He didn't face the city skyline. He faced the movement, because that was what mattered, not the towers but the takeoffs. A new aircraft design lay spread before him. He studied it with the intensity of a man still hungry, not for wealth but for precision. Every measurement told a story. Every seat layout was an argument. Every aisle width a statement of belief. Dignity didn't start when the wheels lifted off. It started when the passenger walked in. He leaned back. He knew the investors would call today. The ones who hadn't believed in him a decade ago. They were calling now because they couldn't afford not to. They'd seen the growth charts. They'd read the customer satisfaction reports. They'd watched videos go viral of elderly black women being escorted onto his planes with care, of single parents crying over how they were treated like human beings, not headcounts. But Elijah didn't chase their approval anymore. He wasn't in the business of pleasing. He was in the business of correcting. The flight industry had always been a gatekeeper, hiding privilege behind platinum cards, boarding priority behind hidden fees, equality behind slogans. Elijah didn't want to flip the system. He wanted to rewrite it. And he had, piece by piece. Sometimes through decisions no one noticed, like approving higher salaries for crew members on regional routes because those flights were often treated as less important. Or adding prayer rooms in small regional terminals. Or ensuring boarding announcements were spoken in multiple languages even when the data said it wasn't efficient. It was never about efficiency. It was about equity. He opened a folder filled with complaints, not from passengers but from rivals. Airlines who accused him of disrupting the premium market, of attracting the wrong demographic, of flooding first class with people who don't understand the brand experience. Elijah smiled without humor. He read those letters like fuel. Because they weren't letters of critique. They were confessions. Admissions that they had never designed their world for someone like him. Admissions that his existence and success threatened the lie that money and worth were always the same. He stepped out of the office and walked the corridor alone. No assistant. No entourage. The employees he passed nodded, some with reverence, some with quiet gratitude. No one stopped him. They all knew not to interrupt when he moved like this, not out of fear, but out of shared purpose. He entered the engineering wing. It still smelled faintly of grease and laser-cut composites. He loved it here not for nostalgia, but for friction. This was where ideas came to life or died. Where every concept was challenged by gravity, physics, material tolerance. A new prototype stood in the middle of the hangar. Sleek, unbranded, waiting. He ran his hand across its edge. Smooth, cold, honest. He thought back to the early days when he'd had to lease used turboprops and paint over old logos himself. He remembered long nights with his first mechanics, arguing over rivet stress and seat placement, not because they didn't believe but because they all cared too much to get it wrong. He stepped into the fuselage. Saturday. Felt the seat give slightly, just enough to hold him like an embrace instead of a test. It was working. All of it. The vision. The risk. The refusal to give up first class as a concept not of opulence but of respect. His phone buzzed. He ignored it. He looked out the cockpit window and watched the rain begin to fall in streaks. Each droplet a timeline. A version of his life where he didn't fight. Where he had accepted the hand-me-downs of policy, the leftovers of legacy. He stood again and moved to the rear of the plane. That was the other truth most forgot. You couldn't lead unless you'd sat at the back. Felt the shake near the engines. Watched every passenger walk past you. Smelled the reheated food after it had passed through 3 cabins. You couldn't design justice if you'd never been treated unjustly. The rain intensified. He stepped off the plane and back into the hangar. His shoes left dark prints on the polished floor. Each one was a story. Each one a protest. He returned to his office just as the call from the boardroom came in. They wanted to go public. He let it ring. Not because he hadn't decided. Because he already had. He picked up the phone. Paused. Then hung up. Because the sky was never the limit. Only the beginning. The conference hall buzzed with artificial light and synthetic conversation. Suits shifted in their chairs like they'd been tailored to sit, not stand. The stage bore the polished sterility of corporate progress, polished wood, LED backlighting and carefully arranged floral arrangements that looked more algorithmic than alive. It was the annual aviation summit. And for the first time in its history, a name previously spoken in backroom skepticism now headlined the banner. Elijah had arrived without fanfare. No luxury convoy. No publicist. Just him. A quiet figure in a charcoal coat, hands tucked in his pockets, face calm in the way only a man who had stopped asking for entry could look. His name tag simply read Elijah R. The badge didn't shimmer. It didn't boast a title. But the moment he stepped through the sliding doors into the exhibitor's wing, attention shifted. Not instantly. Not obviously. But like gravity finding a truer center. Some recognized him. Some didn't, but felt they should. He passed a row of branded booths where traditional airlines displayed renderings of their future, recycled designs, louder colors, quieter truths. His airline had no booth. No handouts. No flashy mock-ups. Because the future he was building was already flying. He walked the aisles with slow, deliberate pace. Watching. He caught snatches of dialogue. Executives speculating about him. Old money whispering warnings. Startups mimicking models they didn't understand. Some praised his brilliance. Others dismissed it as luck. But none of them, not one, understood the cost. Not the sleepless years building systems the industry didn't want. Not the rejection letters that didn't even pretend to be personalized. Not the forced smiles through fundraising rounds where they asked if he'd considered bringing on a more relatable face for branding. They didn't know about the nights in hostels when his bank account read 2 digits. They didn't know about the morning he launched his second route while sitting in a dentist's chair, phone propped between his shoulder and cheek, directing a ground crew that didn't yet know he owned the plane. He reached the registration table for panelists. A young woman looked up, startled. He nodded once. She handed him his pass, her fingers shaking slightly, not out of fear, but recognition. He pinned it without comment and moved toward the back hall. The keynote session had begun. On stage, a speaker from a legacy airline gestured confidently, explaining the necessity of data analytics in modern aviation. Charts filled the screens. Buzzwords filled the air. Elijah listened not out of obligation but curiosity. He always believed that you learned more from repetition than revelation. And what he heard was the same narrative that had always existed: speed, scale, prestige. Efficiency disguised as empathy. He didn't hate them. He just knew they were wrong. When his turn came, he stepped onto the stage without slides. The room didn't go silent. It paused. He reached the podium, adjusted the mic slightly, then stood back. And for a moment, the weight of the space changed. Not because of his posture, not because of some rehearsed confidence, but because truth had entered a room that hadn't invited it. He looked out at them, the executives, the policymakers, the influencers. And they looked back at him, not as a disruptor, but as something harder to define. A reminder that their gatekeeping hadn't worked, that someone they had dismissed, doubted, misnamed, and misread had not only entered their house, he had bought the land beneath it. He didn't speak about valuations. He spoke about walking into terminals where people like his mother were once followed by security. He didn't speak about quarterly growth. He spoke about watching a child with hearing loss board a flight because his airline had prioritized accessibility features others called costly. He didn't ask for applause. And none came. Not at first. But when he finished and stepped away from the podium, the silence held a different kind of power. It wasn't quiet because they didn't care. It was quiet because they understood. And when the clapping began, not thunderous but rising, it came from those who mattered. Engineers. Ground crew. Flight attendants. The people who built the experience, not just sold it. After the session, reporters rushed. He exited through a side hallway. Past security. Out into the loading docks where freight trolleys rolled over concrete. He paused there not because he was lost, because that was where the truth lived. In the back exits. In the overlooked zones. In the places they tried to hide people like him. This was where he had delivered coffee to pilots as a teenager. Where he had eaten cold sandwiches at 2 a.m. on a folding chair. Where he had memorized routes by reading discarded cargo manifests. And now it was where he stood as the man whose company carried more first-time flyers than any other airline in the country. Because that was the seat no one could reserve. The one you earned by refusing to leave the gate they closed on you. The sky had always looked different from the ground. To those with nowhere to go, it was a ceiling. To those with tickets, it was a passage. But to Elijah, it had always been a question, one he'd spent his life answering. Now, at 42,000 feet above the Atlantic, he sat in the last row of his own airline's newest long-haul flight. Not for secrecy. Not for humility. But for audit, he believed in testing the edge cases, and there was no seat farther from privilege than the one closest to the rear lavatory. He folded his hands, resting them atop a lapboard he designed himself, slightly wider, curved to reduce wrist fatigue. Across the aisle, a young man with a sleeping infant rested against the wall, his face weary but peaceful. Elijah had personally written the policy that allowed parents with babies to board early and reserve the back rows for free. It wasn't efficient by corporate standards, but he wasn't building for corporations. He was building for everyone who had ever been told no with a smile. The hum of the aircraft around him was soft, surgical. The air vents above didn't blast, they breathed. He'd insisted on that in the design, because every detail mattered, especially the ones people dismissed. He thought about that first time they told him he was just the delivery guy. He hadn't corrected them then. He didn't need to. He was delivering something. An alternative. A refusal. A future. It had taken him years to understand that not all revolutions looked like fire. Some looked like furniture. Some like food trays that locked more smoothly. Some like crew uniforms that allowed for religious expression without distracting from the brand. He stood up, stretched slowly, walked the aisle just as he had done countless times as a teenager refilling soda cans in the back galley of discount charters. He passed the business section. The lighting was softer here, the spacing wider. But he didn't linger. He passed premium. He didn't stop. He entered the first-class cabin. Every seat was occupied, but every seat held someone who had never been invited before. He didn't need to know their names. He saw it in their posture. Shoulders not hunched in apology. Heads not lowered in fear. They weren't grateful to be there. They were comfortable there. That was the difference. A flight attendant stepped aside quietly as he passed, offering a barely perceptible nod. Not out of fear. Out of understanding. His presence didn't disrupt the order, it reaffirmed it. He approached seat 1A. Not to sit. To look. Because this was where it had begun. Not on a runway. Not in a meeting. In this very chair, years ago, where a stranger's voice had said, "Why are you here?" Not out of curiosity, but out of accusation. And now, across dozens of cities, hundreds of routes, thousands of seats, the question had reversed direction. He stood still. Outside, the sky bled from deep violet into gold as dawn began to rise beyond the curve of the earth. Below them, the ocean whispered past. But Elijah didn't look down. He looked inward. At every version of himself that had been told to wait, to earn, to ask for less. At the boy who had memorized flight schedules on torn paper. At the man who'd been laughed out of boardrooms. At the founder who built an empire quietly, one corrected assumption at a time. He turned and walked back down the aisle, returning to the rear, to his seat, to his journal. Not to write his story, but to leave space for the ones coming next. The ones still being dismissed. Still being doubted. Still being asked, "Why are you here?" Because one day they would be the ones flying the plane. And the world wouldn't see it coming. But he would, because he built the runway they'd take off from.